You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Orn Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 36 of the Book Talk Today podcast. Today we are joined by Scott Young. Scott is a writer who undertakes interesting self-education projects, such as attempting to learn MIT's 4-year CS curriculum in 12 months and learning 4 languages in 1 year. And today we'll be discussing his book, Ultralearning, Accelerate Your Career, Master Hard Skills, and Outsmart the Competition. Scott, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Oh, it's great to be here.
I love that title, by the way, because it's like there's no fooling that title. It's like there's no ambiguity at all in that title. It's like you know what you're getting. I love it because sometimes you see books and it's so vague and you don't know what you're going to get. So good.
Well, I'm glad.
Title.
I spent a lot of time on the subtitle. That was very hard for me to write that. So I have like a notebook full of like all the possible things I could write. And I hated like almost all of them. So I'm glad that one passed muster in your eyes.
What was some of the ones that were thrown off in the notebook then?
Oh, well, I can't even remember. This is like 3-4 years ago, and there were hundreds of bad ones, so I've blotted them from my memory. But I remember the real difficulty was it was difficult to write a book with learning in the title and make people think, obviously, that it's not necessarily just a book for students. I think that was the thing I was worried about, that anytime you have learning, people think school, and they're like, I'm not in school, I don't need this book. And I wanted to grab them by the lapels and be like, so much more than that. But, so I think finding a way, I think the career or competition I think it helped it kind of steer it as like, this is not just about, how to study for your calculus final, but how to, do better in life, hopefully.
Yeah, accelerate just beyond school, definitely. I mean, as someone who loves to learn, loves to read, I think that the more that you read and the more you appreciate that learning is a lifelong process and it's never too late. And the best skill to learn is the skill to learn, if that makes sense. So before we get into some of the principles within the book, I have many questions regarding it. I think it would be good just to define your journey to becoming an ultra learner and why you believe it to be so important.
Well, okay. So I don't know whether my journey is particularly important. I think there's something always a little egotistical about writing a book where you insert yourself into it. And I think I wrote this book almost to pay homage to the people that inspired me, like all the people that I think encouraged me to, try some of these projects. And so I hope that some of the stories that I talk about in the book will have an influence on people. But for myself, there's a couple key moments I think that really steered me toward this. So one of them was when I was a teenager. I remember reading an article written by Steve Pavlina, the personal development blogger, and he wrote about getting a computer science degree in 3 semesters by just being really productive with his courses and how he organized it. And that just I just thought that was so cool. And I also thought it was so cool because it's like, you actually have to break the rules to do that. Like schools won't let you just take your entire degree in 1 year, even if you could handle the course load. There's rules. You can't take more than this many credits. You have to take these classes, and they basically put up a lot of bureaucratic hurdles. So just that was one example for me of maybe, the 4 years is just sort of an arbitrary number, right? Like there's nothing set in stone about it. And then another really big example that was more recent, more recent in the stories I'm telling in the book, was meeting Benny Lewis. And Benny Lewis was someone I met sort of in the kind of tail end of my university degree. And he was doing these public live challenges, like not just talking about them after he was done them, but I'm going to do this, and then writing about it while he was doing it. And that just really struck me for its, I guess you could say its authenticity, because it's always easy to look back and kind of cherry pick the times things worked out for you and then hold them up as an example. And we all do this, but I think there was something there's something really exciting about the person who's willing to call their shot, like the person who's like, okay, I'm going to do this right now. Watch me. And so Benny Lewis, I think I also encountered him in a time when I was trying to learn a language. I was doing an exchange in France and I was struggling to learn French. And so just the idea that someone would be bold enough to be like, I'm going to be having conversation in this language in 3 months and it'll be like Czech or something, not always just something that's super easy either, really inspired me. And so those were a few examples. And of course, in the book, I talk about many more. But these sort of nudged me toward this idea of kind of weird, aggressive self-education projects. And so that was sort of the idea I wanted to write about in the book. And I should note that I don't think that the goal of the book is for everyone to travel to another country and learn new languages or to try to get a degree really fast, but just to broaden their mind about what's possible in terms of learning and what's possible in terms of acquiring useful skills and knowledge and this kind of thing. And so I hoped they served as kind of inspiration, not necessarily as like a template to follow.
Yeah, I definitely think books like these definitely serve for inspiration for individuals perhaps who have tried many things but have failed because perhaps their approach hasn't been correct. They've had the impetus at the start. Everyone wants to learn more languages, but many go on to Duolingo, spend a week, and then they're done kind of thing after they realize.
Don't get me started on Duolingo.
Sorry?
I said, don't get me started on Duolingo.
Oh, go on. What's the flaws with Duolingo?
Well, I don't like to be overly negative because I feel like there's people who they like Duolingo, and then if I'm the one saying, no, don't use Duolingo, then I'm taking something away from them. Then maybe they were having fun collecting the gemstones or whatever you do with Duolingo.
Yeah, but there's a difference between the fun and then the learning, though, isn't there?
Yeah, so I feel like... and I mean, admittedly, this is my opinion, but I think that the problem with Duolingo is that they designed it to be as compelling as possible. It was as if I'm imagining you sit down in a room and you said, how can we make people use the app as much as possible? Not necessarily what will be the things that people will need to do if they really wanted to learn language X. And so I talk about, it seems like kind of technical nitpicking, but I don't think it really is. So one of the things that really bothered me is that one of the early tasks, I used it for a little bit to learn Italian because I was like, what's all this Duolingo stuff? And I was going to go to Italy. I was like, let's try it out. And one of the tasks they had was this kind of it had a word bank and you had a sentence in English and you had to make the sentence in Italian by dragging the words up there. And it just, to me, just epitomized that's not what you do when you're speaking a language at all. It's not a word bank, drag things in the right order. And you have all sorts of stupid clues, like the fact that the first word's always capitalized. So you look for the capitalized word to put first and this kind of stuff. And so, and they have different exercises. So I'm not trying to say that's the entire app, but I felt very much first of all, there's no recall there. The hard thing about vocabulary is that you have to remember it while you're not looking at it, which is
in conversation
a huge thing. You actually have to speak it and be fluent. And I know they do have the little speak this thing, which is good, but I also know lots of people who never use that feature. They don't do it. They skip those ones. And it's, so much of a language is about communicating with people. And so there is also something, even in a really well-designed sort of academic style course where you're doing a grammar textbook or something, which is hard and is giving you real questions, there's always a hint of artificiality about it, in that it's treating it a little bit like it's this kind of logical task rather than a task of communicating with a real person. And so my feeling is that, almost every single person who wants to learn a language would be much better off using something like italki to actually practice with people. And I personally, if you're not at the level where you're able to have any kind of conversation, or you're just no way, I'm not considering that at all. I personally think Pimsleur does a better job, because at least at the end of Pimsleur, you can say the sentences that they teach you in Pimsleur, and that has some, limited utility. But I mean, this is just an example. I feel like when I was doing research for the book, it became clear to me that it's not just language learning, it's everything. People use really bad strategies for studying. And so I feel a little bit sheepish sometimes because people talk to me like I have some special ultralearning method that I have some secret method that'll make you learn faster. And I feel like the truth is actually more the opposite, that just most people have really bad strategies without realizing it. And it's not my knowledge. This is there's reams of scientific research that show that this is the right way to study that people don't know about. And so I don't have any secret method. It's just rather that I think there are more effective ways to study than is often the case that people are using. And so I think, Duolingo is I feel an egregious example, but there's many more. Well, it's a little bit of an example there. Yeah.
I mean, for me, the question that I had for you potentially is, if there's so much research out there about this being the right way to learn, or research out there to showcase this research, why hasn't it made its way into schools and into general populations if the research is out there?
So that's a good question. One of them is simply that it kind of has, but not in the way that you'd think. So, I know this because my parents were school teachers, and so they would go to these professional development seminars where there would always be the latest educational researcher talking about the latest, we found students learn better doing this and stuff. But my parents weren't going to the classroom and then teaching that to the students. They were just trying to use that, hopefully, to reflect on their curricula. So there probably have been a lot of shifts in the classes you've taken compared to, let's say, 100 years ago that are reflective of developments in cognitive science. Unfortunately, a lot of educational research is not that bad. Some of the fads are kind of, I don't want to say that it's all good and everything is clear. So there is a lot of, different schools of thought on things there. And I think that influences education. Not to mention that as institutions, schools have so many other constraints, they have to teach this very specific curricula and they have to hit all these targets. And if there's standardized tests, they have to prepare their kids for the standardized tests. And there's all these other things that go into it. So basically what you see is the kind of finished product of a bunch of different people who are all sort of, doing their best, but sometimes not always the best informed, but just trying to work together under lots of constraints, and then this is the end product. And as a student, though, this is all invisible to you. And so I think it might be nice if there was a study skills class which taught students how to study for things, or even just before you begin difficult classes, that there was, something explaining the benefit of spacing, or explaining the benefit of retrieval practice, or explaining that, you need to really work on understanding the idea, not just trying to memorize the solution procedure. All of these things that I think are fairly well understood outside of, inside the cognitive science literature. And so I think that could be beneficial. And I know some places they do try to do little bits of that. But I think also part of it is that there is, I think, a prevailing assumption in education that it kind of often treats the student as a sort of a passive object. Like, what can we do to make them learn, as opposed to really adopting the student's perspective of what can I do to help this person achieve their goals and learn the things that they are interested in and they have a motivation to do. And you never see it spelled out that way, but you read a lot of stuff and it seems like that's the way that we think about it, is that we tell teachers what to do and they teach the students, and the students sit there and they absorb. And this model of education is I think deeply rooted in our kind of cultural psychology. And so for me, I'm just one guy writing a book, and I'm not even a scientist, so you can dismiss me. But I think that what I'm trying to do is flip that script a little bit and to offer a book that is really from the perspective of a learner, from someone who, not just how do you study a test, but if you were to take control of your own education, if you were to take control of your own skills and development and training, what would you do? What would be the right way to do it? And so I think there are far fewer books written with that perspective in mind than there are from, teacher-centric or institutionally centric approaches of how do we fix education, or what's the best way to teach schools, or what have you.
I think when someone observes an individual like yourself who has this constant curiosity for learning, they're often questioning what the motivation is. So I think it might be good just to talk about what your motivation is to continue to learn and challenge yourself in this way?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think there's at some point you just have to say to yourself, like, either you think it's cool or it's not, right? Like, either you think learning multiple languages is cool or you don't care. And if you don't care, I'm not going to try to sell you on it. Like, if anything,
Depends. It
it's a lot of
depends
hard
what
work,
your goal is, though, because like it's cool
Yeah.
to the degree that you can go to a foreign country and communicate and visit it and not feel like an alien. But then others would be like, well, that's not my goal. So,
well, that's fine. I think for me, I think there's a utility to being able to learn and study effectively. So even if you had no interest in a particular subject matter, you're going to have to learn things to just live your life, right? Like you have to get through school. When you're in your job, you're going to have to learn. I'm constantly getting emails from people who are like, oh, I have to get this certification, or I have to do this, or this is the thing standing in the way of my professional success and I need to learn this. So I know that these are common cases, and often the thing you have to learn is not particularly exciting. It's, it's often something kind of dry and technical. And, I was talking to a guy who wanted to become a marine pilot. So it's not just airplanes. You can have a marine pilot. And basically what he had to do was just like memorize in detail these extremely specific like shoreline charts of like where every single island and rock and this kind of stuff is.
Oh, wow.
And as you can imagine, this is an enormously tedious task to do. But you can kind of flip the script a little bit on that because, yeah, even though it's kind of boring and tedious, it's sort of also a puzzle. It's kind of like, how do I get my mind to basically memorize this map? Like, how do I get my mind to be able, so when I'm on the test, I can sort of say, yep, you need to look for this buoy and then do this, and that's how you charter a course around here. And so I think there's, a kind of intrinsic interest that I have in the learning process itself, even above the subject matter. So I'm often drawn to subjects just because it's kind of like, ooh, that seems really difficult. I don't know how you would do that, and then that's what piques my interest. And so I hope with this book, I'm kind of open that world up to some people. Because as I said, it's one that like you get filtered through it in school, but you never really touch it directly. And then I think also there's just a real sense that we live inside the boxes of the skills that we're good at, right? Like you studied something in school, so that's what your job is. You were good at this hobby when you were 4, so that's what you do as an adult. Like I was good at soccer, so I only play soccer now. I never play a piano or paint or anything like that. I'm not good at X. And these are often implicit and they just kind of box us in. And I'm not trying to make the case that, you shouldn't work on your strengths and you just have to spend all your time doing these things that you're bad at. But I do feel that this is a kind of limiting way to live your life, that you only can do these things that, you just happen to figure out when you were a kid. And so I hope at least that this book offers some inspiration so that, either someone who has to learn something and it can give them some tools for it, or someone who wants to maybe expand their potential, that there's something that they've always thought was really cool, but they're not quite sure how to approach it. They haven't been successful at it before, and to give them, all the knowledge that we have about what's the best way to learn things. So this is my motivation for writing this book, and I hope people like it. I know that learning is not always the topic that everyone is interested. Everyone wants to make money and this kind of thing, but like learning is often a secondary concern. But I really do think that it's deeper in terms of your personal happiness than just making a lot of money.
I think it's one of those books, Scott, that those that are obsessed with it are going to be obsessed with it. It's one of those books, like for me, as like someone like me who just loves this kind of stuff. When I'm reading it, I'm like, yes, 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 yes. Like, just lives that life. And I think in general application, I think the principles do permeate, but I think there's obviously like a degree to which like you said, people just want to know the quick ways to make a big a buck and then move on kind of thing. So I think it would be good actually to talk about some of the principles in the book. So you talk about things like meta learning, you talk about focus, you talk about retention and directedness, like different principles. There's 9 in total. Do you believe that each hold equal importance, or do you believe some hold more weight than others?
Well, I think that they all serve different roles, and so some projects are going to really rely on one idea, like that's the idea that's going to be the breakthrough, and then for other projects that principle might just be totally irrelevant. So like if I were studying for an exam, standardized exam or something like that. The chapter on retrieval would probably be the most important chapter I could give someone, because it's the most neglected advice when it comes to kind of traditional test studying. However, if I were learning skiing, it doesn't really matter that much, right? You're not doing that much like, oh, I have to recall this from memory when I'm skiing. It's just it relies on different sort of learning subsystems in the brain. And so I think what I'm hoping is to give people enough of these principles, both so that they have a kind of roadmap, so that when they're approaching a new project, they're kind of like, they have some sense of what the ingredients would have to be, but also hopefully so that when they can think of stuff that they are either learning now or have learned in the past, they can be like, that's what I was doing right, or that's what I was doing wrong. And they can kind
most of the time.
see that. Like I've had people that have told me after they read the book that, like, they really like the directness chapter, because it was just kind of like it clicked for them in a moment that, like, oh, I'm not actually doing the real thing. Like, I'm not actually doing the practice that is the thing that I need to be good at. I'm doing something else. And it was just like they just hadn't made that connection. And, like, that's sort of my critique of Duolingo is that, this is not speaking a language. I'm sorry, it's not, and there's a limited overlap of what you're doing mentally to do that, but it's limited in my opinion. And so the people that I know who are really good at speaking languages, I don't know anyone who uses Duolingo. And so, it's the most popular thing. It's the most popular thing. And so I talk to people, but I think that's just an example that, you talk to people and you ask them what they're doing when they're studying, and you often get revealed these sort of like that's just obviously not going to work, but the person doesn't realize it. So, even just as an example of like the person who just looks over their notes before studying for a test, right? You're not going to be able to recall it on the test if you do that. You're just going to get really familiar with it, but the efficiency is going to be really low. Whereas if you close the book, try to remember what's on it, and then check to see whether you got it right, that you're already many times more efficient than you were before. So it's these little kind of like, maybe you're making these whoopsie daisies in your learning plans that are hopefully going to be giving people some benefits from the book.
Yeah, I think the thing that I really took from it with the principles is the thing that you just mentioned, and the fact that I look back at the things that I started and didn't complete to the degree that I would like to, and think, oh, what did I do wrong? And then once you sort of target what you've done wrong, then you can obviously then focus on that going forward. So in relation to the principles, what has been one of your hardest skills to learn, and what principle from the 9 helped you achieve that?
Well, there's different types of difficulty, I would say. So, in terms of that was hard to learn that, like I could list a few things. I thought learning quantum mechanics was difficult. I thought learning Mandarin Chinese was and is difficult. I thought that, a lot of the things that I learned, I picked them because they were also hard. And so in those cases, though, the skill was fairly well defined. And so I can point to, well, the thing that's hard about Chinese is that you have like totally different words, totally different cultural background. Like, you have to learn everything from scratch. You can't benefit, like, there's very few cognates with English. You're really just like learning to speak from zero, and that's a lot of work. And everyone knows there's thousands of characters that you have to learn if you want to read and write, and all that kind of thing. And like quantum mechanics, obviously it's just, you're dealing with complex numbers in multiple dimensions, and there's tons of really difficult calculus. And so, I don't need to explain why that's difficult. And I think, though, that often what we face is not these really concrete, obviously difficult skills like Chinese or quantum mechanics, but it's things like I'll give you an honest, the thing that I've struggled with the most is probably writing. Like, writing, I've put in more time than any other skill, and it's really hard to get good at it. And partly because there's no real clear criterion for like, now you're a good writer. You write stuff, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not, and you see other people's writing and you're like, well, that's amazing, I wish I had written that, or that's really good, or it clicks for you. And so I think that the skills that most people depend on and rely on in their everyday lives are more like writing than like Chinese. They're more in this kind of hard because they're nebulous and vague, and it's hard to even see what it is you're trying to get good at, and you can spend years doing it and still be mediocre at it. So I think that those are areas where it really helps to try to break down the learning process and see what's involved, and to ask yourself kind of critical questions about, well, what is it that I'm doing here, and what is it that, I could be doing to improve and stuff.
Yeah, I think those ambiguous ones are where there's no defined end, Yeah. I mean, I guess when you're learning, well, even if you're learning Mandarin, I'm like, where does it end? Like, it doesn't just end with one conversation, does it?
Yeah. It doesn't end. Like, I think that's true of almost all skills. That there's always another level that you can get better at them. But I think that when you think about like typically hard, difficult skills, they often are a little bit more concrete. So like with Chinese, you can sort of, okay, I can understand this material. I know this many words. I don't know these words. Like, there's a certain sharpness to what you're actually learning, Sometimes that can be an illusion. I know that, it's very easy to count how many words are on your flashcards, and that's not quite the same thing as being able to speak, kind of in the same as the Duolingo way. And as a guy who's made lots of flashcards, I'm aware of this as a self-criticism. But the thing with, a lot of the skills that we actually care about is just that they kind of, like writing is something that, once you reach grade 6, pretty much everyone can do it at least a little bit. But there's some people that are, amazing at it, and some people are not. And it's hard to figure out why, and breaking it down and stuff is difficult. And so those kind of skills excite me too, because I think if you only limit learning to the situations where what is to be learned is like really well defined, then you miss out on just how much learning permeates our entire lives, that like everything we do is a kind of learning challenge in a way.
Yeah, the difficulty in that, though, is like if someone was going to approach a subject or a skill with that mindset, they have to be very motivated to continue it, because there's no end goal. Like, okay, how do you do a map? How do you plan your learning if perhaps there's no end point?
Well, I think endpoints are important, but I think they're always a little arbitrary too. I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with, as a writer, being like, I want to write a book, like that's a kind of endpoint. And it doesn't mean you've finished writing. It's just sort of
complete,
but it is something that you can work toward. So I think that's true of all skills. Like, I had a conversation with a good friend of mine who runs a website for learning Chinese. And I was joking to him. I was just sort of saying, I've kind of gotten over that beginner phase, and I'm in this sort of intermediate phase where I can kind of chat with people, but there's always like little things that I'm missing and stuff. And he's like, congratulations, that's just it from now on. Like, you're just now this forever. It's just kind of like, I wish I knew this a little bit more, but I don't. And like, that's it now. That's where you are. And I think it's very true. Is just that, there's always more to learn and improve and stuff. And so you're right. There is a motivational angle to that, because it's a lot easier if you put it in a box and say, okay, this is what you have to learn, and don't worry about everything else outside of it. But I think there's also something more exciting about learning skills that directly translate to what you care about, And so a lot of the stuff we learn in school does feel kind of, it's in a box, but it's also totally arbitrary, and we don't feel like we use it after we graduate. Whereas, learning something that's vitally connected to your life, that's going to impact your career, your relationships, your hobbies, it's going to give you a source of pride. These are the things that matter deeply. And so I think being able to get some kind of grasp on them is so valuable, even if they are a little bit slipperier.
Definitely. I know in the last couple of months, and that's why I feel like this book is timely for me. In the book, you talk about your 4-year to 12-month MIT computer science. I haven't gone quite down that route, but I've definitely gone down the route of learning how to program and to code. So I'm going to use some of the principles from this book. So actually, it'd be good to talk about that a bit. How did you? Can you talk about that? The 4-year MIT into 1 year and your experiences with doing that.
This has been a project that has like greatly exceeded my thoughts when I started it, because like now it's like over 10 years that I did this, and people still asking me about it. But basically, I had graduated from business school. I found these courses online. MIT posted them. And I was a good student in my undergrad. I'd already been writing about studying stuff on my blog. So I already had this kind of like efficient studying was my thing before I did this. And I was primed by Benny Lewis, who was doing these kind of like intense compressed challenges. And so I just thought, oh, I wonder if you could like just streamline it and like just do the final exams. Could you get it done in a much shorter time frame? And a year, just I don't know where I came up with that, but that just like stuck out at me. Like, could you do it in a year, right?
Yeah.
And I did add the programming projects at the end, which didn't actually add that much work to the project. It sounds like it would have added a lot more than it actually did. But this was the idea. It was just kind of like the material's there, the exams and solutions are there. Has anyone ever tried this before? And it really just exceeded my expectations, just how people responded to it. Because again, even today I get, like that's how people like, oh yeah, you're the guy who did the MIT challenge is how people know of me. So I don't know whether when I'm 50, I'm going to regret that, but I don't
think there's any point that that's going to be a regret, Scott. I think.
Well, I just mean that, how it defines me later. But I think it was something that was just really exciting for me as just purely as a intellectual challenge. I was also really interested in computer science. I'd wanted to major it in school, and I'd kind of like, I should probably study business because I was an idiot, and I thought business was like, if you wanted to start a business, you should study business. Not true, by the way. Like, you can take like a couple classes. Most of the business classes are just like, they're only about working in big companies. You're like, you do not need to like take an HR class to learn how to deal with unions. This is one of the things that
was one of the modules.
Oh yeah, because you have to talk about like labor relations and stuff. Because they're like training you to maybe be a manager in a factory, and mostly just like, here's all the things that are illegal that you can't do. Anyway, I've tried to forget a lot of this stuff, but yeah, exactly, and like theories of big organizations and stuff. And so I kind of felt after that like, oh, I should have learned something actually useful, like programming. I shouldn't have learned this. And so I was interested in going back to school and doing this, and this just sort of seemed like, well, I don't really need another degree. Let's do this, right? And it just kind of exploded way beyond what I was anticipating. And I think in some ways the project was a success. Like, I feel like I did what I set out to do. I feel like I passed the exams, and I feel like I was able to learn the material, and to the extent that what you can do when you're doing that. I feel like I did it. But in some ways I also felt like the project was a failure, because I think I really did not think I would be the only one doing this. I really thought that this would be a thing, and I was just like, no one has done it before, so I could do it first, and then like everyone's going to be doing this. And I really I think overestimated just the willingness of people to do something like this. But
I just really believe that people were going to do it after you'd done it?
Well, maybe not in a year. Like, I think that was my little ambitious spin on it. But I just figured, like, well, people are already spending like tens of thousands of dollars in university education. You could just go learn it. Just do it like that, right? And I still to this day don't really see there being a major barrier to that. I mean, the MIT classes are hard, but I mean, they're hard when you're in MIT. I don't think that there's a really big difference between what I did and an MIT student did in terms of like, my job was so much more difficult because of X. Like, I think, when I was in university, I never interacted with the professors. You sit in the class, they lecture at you, you go show up to the exam. Like, I did the same things that I did when I was doing this. Yeah. I guess there wasn't office hours and you can't talk to peers, but again, I had this idea that like, this kind of using MOOCs and online courses as a replacement to traditional education. Like, I thought this was for sure, this is what was going to happen. And I think I was a little bit naive in some ways of, what is the formal education system actually doing. And I've become a little bit more cynical in my old age that like, I do really think that the kind of credentialing process dominates the educating process in a lot of school type settings. But in some ways, I'm also happy that I was a little naive, because otherwise I wouldn't have done this weird project. And it was good for me. Like, I liked it. It served my goals, and I was very happy when I finished it. And I'm happy that it continues to pique people's interests today.
Yeah, I think when you look at something like that, and then the naivety is definitely there, but you can't, for instance, we come from an Asian background, subcontinental background, and education, formal education, in the sense of a certification, is placed on such a high mantle.
Yeah.
So you can't be accepted is the wrong word, but parental and cultural factors definitely come into the education system that can't be overlooked. I mean, if I was to tell, for instance, like my grandmother, who places such a high emphasis on certification, that I was just doing a course online, she'd be like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is in the background of a lot of the culture, and I think that was something I didn't fully appreciate. But at the same time, I was kind of a weird case, because the thing that I was considering doing instead, which was to go back to my alma mater, which was not a super prestigious school, and do I would have been able to enroll as a mature student, so I would have been able to kick some of the electives because I'd already done them in my original undergrad, and get a second degree. Like, there's kind of questionable, like, how much, that would have been so much better on my resume than what I actually did, So I think in my particular case, I don't think it hurt me that much. Now, I didn't end up going into computer science professionally, which I think is something that, I've been criticized for a little bit, because, how do you know whether it worked if you didn't actually get a job? And I did get a few job offers. I remember when there was a little bit of the media brouhaha around it, I did get a few people who were like, "You should work for my startup." And there's a guy from Microsoft who was like, I could get you an interview and this kind of thing. We'd like that. And I remember him telling me in the interview, like, how many people he works with don't have degrees in computer science. Like, they have like a degree in like music or anthropology or something, and they just learn programming. So I don't think I'm as unusual as it seems. Like, I think there's lots of people who succeed professionally that have either don't have credentials, or they have credentials in something like totally unrelated to what they're doing.
Yeah.
But I think that the thing that I sort of underestimated maybe was just that, like, for me, it was really interesting. Like, I really wanted to learn it. And I think that maybe that's kind of rare. I don't know. People talk to me about the challenge later and ask me sort of, and the focus always is on like, oh, you must have been so motivated. And like, I did have to be motivated. I was working really hard, but I think, I look back at those times really fondly. Like, I really enjoyed learning all those classes, and I thought it was really interesting, and I liked most of them. I thought they were cool. It was a cool subject, and I liked them a lot more than my regular university classes. So I don't know. I think my mental image of what that process was like is also a little different than how maybe people imagine me doing it.
It's an interesting observation, though, because what you're basically saying is you're learning for the sake of learning, for a intrinsic reason, rather than perhaps an external reason of getting a job or getting a validation from an external source.
Well, I do think that if, like, as I said, I kind of feel like I didn't get into that field professionally because, sort of ironically, the MIT challenge just did so much for my writing career that it was like, okay, no, I was already happy being a writer, but it was like I was really happy being a writer after.
The irony of that is brilliant.
So it was just kind of like, okay, yeah, no, actually, there's no point in getting a programming job right now. But I think that so I think there could have been like getting employment opportunities out of that. And I had considered it. There was a little like window where I was considering kind of doing something like that. But I feel like I've always been more interested in entrepreneurship and doing my own thing. And that was what I got to do as a result of this project. So I didn't really want to pursue a job in it. And I think that, I don't know. I feel like the intrinsic interest is also something that's deep within me for lots of things. Like, since this project, I've done lots of classes, like, just done them, like right now I'm watching Yale. Yale has a financial markets class, and so I just started watching that one. And I think I was watching organic chemistry. It was also, Yale has a lot of good stuff on YouTube. I've been watching a lot of Yale courses recently. And so, like, even to this day, this is kind of like a hobby pastime. So, like, I just kind of have them on in the background, and I'll just watch them. And sometimes if I get really keen, I'll like do the full course and actually like do the tests and stuff too. But often it's just for me, it's just for interest's sake. I like doing it. And I think that kind of deeper understanding of the world, that like this is these are some fundamental ideas that make sense of the chaos you perceive in the world around you. I really believe that. And I think, learning the computer science stuff, I feel like, ironically, I think it had a much bigger effect on me doing the cognitive science research for this book than actually me programming for a living, because cognitive science and all of the stuff about the brain, there's all these computer analogies. And so if you understand ideas like caching and memoization, and you understand things like, feedback loops and processing, and I don't want to say that these are exactly the same concepts, but very frequently, they will talk about, I was reading some neuroscience papers recently, and they're talking about reinforcement learning in the brain. And if you study reinforcement learning and machine learning, you kind of know what that is, and you know how it works, right? Because they're talking about the same concepts.
Yeah,
and so I think there's, if you have this kind of appetite for learning ideas and you're interested in it, and, especially if you're the kind of person that you liked taking some classes in college, I think that the online courseware available right now from top universities, it's a real treasure trove, because, until this point, maybe you could go to the library and try to decipher some textbook or something, but there's just so much material now that really anything you're interested in learning, you can learn.
Is that your preferred method of learning then? Is it to watch videos rather than to read actually formal books, or is it a combination?
I do both. I think for me, I signaling out the videos because I find there are certain moments in my day. Like, again, I'm doing this more for entertainment than the hard studying. Like, I'm really often I'm advocating really doing the homeworks and the problem sets and this kind of stuff. And that's what I did during the MIT challenge. And I do think you learn it better. But if you're just it's this or Netflix, watching a course is not so bad. And so I do both. I read a lot of books too. I think that textbooks can be really good. I've read a few textbooks recently that I really liked, but I think that by and large, the course format is often better for getting at what I want to get out of learning than just picking up random books. Because, let's say you get I'll give a good example. So Michael Sandel has a really, really popular Harvard course online called Justice. Fantastic course. And he wrote a book following it because it was so popular. But he also has a book, I think, that was kind of his views on things, called The Tyranny of Merit, that was also published recently. And it's interesting to me to contrast those, because The Tyranny of Merit is Michael Sandel making his argument of what he thinks about our society, and this is his viewpoint, right? Whereas when you take Justice course, Harvard isn't just saying, okay, Michael Sandel, go just tell us what you think about things. He's trying to overview the history of philosophy and all these major great debates about, consequentialism versus deontology, and, these various different ethical systems and stuff. Yeah. And so to me, I think if you already knew all of that, then yeah, reading the Michael Sandel book is probably pretty useful. But I think most people don't know this stuff. And so it's much better to start with what is the basics? What is the entire, summarize the Western tradition in terms of this is how to think about ethics. Way better to start with the Justice course than his new book. No offense to Michael Sandel. And I feel that's true of lots of things, that if I want to learn, I would rather take the, Nobel laureate economist course than to read his recent book or, New York Times op-ed, just because one of them is going to be, let's try to provide the consensus of a view of a discipline that has, stood the test of time, versus, here's my thoughts on why all my colleagues are wrong about some specific thing that, maybe you're not even really able to follow. And so to me, I really feel like courses are a better foundation if that's what you're trying to get from knowledge, because that's what they're aiming at. Whereas I feel like books, especially the kind that you'll see being reviewed in various places, are usually they're a specific perspective. They're often aiming at originality and novelty, and so in the same vein, I feel like you'd be much better off to if you wanted to really learn the foundations of learning, to just take some course of the psychology of learning, or take some course about memory or something, or read Alan Badley's Human Memory textbook, if you wanted to like understand memory, then read it like filtered through me, where I'm trying to be entertaining and exciting and stuff too.
Maybe The Psychology of Learning is your next book.
No, well, I think I'd have to be a psychologist to write The Psychology of Learning. I don't think they'd let me get away with that. But there's lots of books like that. That's the thing. I think that's another example that, like, you glance on the bestseller lists and it's just just a bunch of like self-help books. But if you go into the back shelves, like, they have books like this. There's books that are, psychology of learning that have really interesting stuff. And so, I don't know, people could read them.
If they want to. There was actually a couple of like specific questions I had to some of the actual principles in the book. So in the book you talk about active recall and free recall. A question that I had is, are they different or are they the same?
Okay, so active recall, and I mean, this is how I've been using the term, but I talk about active recall versus passive review. So that's the binary distinction that I'm making in there.
Okay.
And so active recall is any kind of situation where you have to remember something from memory rather than looking at it. Free recall is the free and free recall is a more specific paradigm that they were using in some of the studies, which is the like close the book, I don't have any questions or prompts. So one could argue that doing homework problems is a kind of active recall because they're giving you a question and you have to do it. But it's not free recall, because free recall is just there's nothing there. And so, again, I don't think that's sort of pedantic nitpicking. I think they're probably, you can use them interchangeably for a lot of purposes. But in the book, when I'm talking about free recall, that's what I mean, is the close the book. I have a blank piece of paper. What do I remember? But I would say, doing flashcards is a kind of active recall, but it's not free recall.
What the thing that I would question is the purpose of free recall then, is that just to see what you've remembered rather than active recall is specific on a certain topic or hypothesis?
Well, no, I think free recall, the main advantage is you don't have to have any material, right? So you can always do free recall. But if you don't have questions, let's say you're listening to this podcast right now and I paused it. I'm using my magic powers. I paused it and just asked you, what were we talking about? I could give you some questions and you can answer them. And like, presumably if I'm the person deciding what you should be gaining from this podcast, I could design the questions in a way to test you on what I think is important. But I don't have those questions for you. But you could still pause it and see what you remember. Like, oh, what was he talking about this or something? Like, if you assume you want to remember. But and you could do that, and that would strengthen your memory. And the reason I think free recall is important, and why I highlighted the Jeffrey Karpicki studies that were done using these free recall paradigms, is because, first of all, it doesn't require any material. So, like the classic, well, yeah, I would do practice tests, but I don't have practice tests, doesn't apply to this line of reasoning. The second reason I think it's important is it distinguishes two different effects, which again is a little nitpicky, but people think that the reason that you do homework is to get feedback, so see what you got wrong, and that is an effect, and I talk about it in the book. But there's lots of studies showing that merely the fact of testing yourself, even if you have no idea what you got right or wrong, you'll still do better. So recall is independent from feedback. Recall still helps you prepare for a test, even if you can't evaluate what you're recalling. So closing the book and doing free recall, even if you never open the book again, it will help you. And so obviously it's better to do both. And so this is like kind of an unnecessary, distinction. But I point that out because I think a lot of times when I talk to people, the way they view doing homework is I want to test myself and check what I know. And I really want to assert that it is the act of trying to remember things that strengthens this kind of, you can imagine there's kind of a search pattern in your brain to retrieve information given, some kind of vague prompt. And the strengthening of that is a major component of learning. And if you don't do that, if you just look at it, it's a lot harder. And so, there's lots of examples of this, but the free recall is like a more narrow term that refers to this, like close the book, just see what you remember. But I would include active recall, any kind of studying habit where you have to remember things and can't look at them, but that could include homework, that could include problem solving, that could do doing a project. Those are all active kinds of learning, whereas sitting and watching a video, re-looking at your notes, that kind of stuff is passive.
Yeah, I know I implement active recall into my note taking when it comes to reading books. So I don't take notes as I'm reading through the chapter. I read a chapter and then active recall on the points that I remember from the book.
Yeah, and that's great. I think that works really well.
For me, because I used to take notes as I was going through, but then I'd be done with the book and I'm like, I don't actually remember anything. I had to look through my notes again to remember. Whereas I found when active recalling, I'm like, well, I know it was in chapter 3 because I remembered that without having to look back at it on the first time reading. Because a lot of people struggle to remember what they read the first time reading it. But I found with active recall, even if it's just doing it once, you're like, well, I actually remember what was in chapter 3 because I wrote down a summary.
That's a really good point, because I talk to people who say like, oh, I'm so bad. I read books and I don't remember what I read from them. Like, how can I improve my memory or something like this? And people don't realize that's everyone. Like, everyone reads books and remembers vanishingly small amounts of what was in the book. And everyone watches a lecture and can recall, just the gist of small parts of it. I don't want to say that this means that reading books and watching lectures is useless. I think they serve an important function, but I think I feel like useful knowledge is much closer to a skill that requires practice than I think people often give credit for. That I watched this and I remembered it, I think is valuable, but particularly for things where you are going to need to use this in some place, this idea of practicing. And so I think the recall idea that remembering is a skill, right? That we don't often think of remembering as a skill, but remembering something specific given a particular prompt is a skill that requires practice, the way that riding a bicycle requires practice, I think is an underappreciated point.
Definitely, I believe it so. As someone who loves to read and has a blog where I make videos about it as well, it's funny when people look to me potentially, and they do this all the time in my Q&As, is they're like, well, how do you remember all the things that you've read? And I'm like, I don't. I just remember the specific things that I was trying to achieve before reading it. If there was a certain thing or a certain question or something that I was looking for an answer to, then that's usually the case. One of the things I wanted to mention actually was there was a consistent theme throughout the book about the examples of individuals, whether they be Richard Feynman or others, being very much obsessed with their ultralearning on a certain subject and the role that played. So can you just talk about the role that just pure obsession and motivation plays in becoming an ultralearner or learning something that's very complex?
I think obsession is really important. I think there was, at some point I was considering it for one of the principles, and I didn't end up doing it, but I think obsession was a through line in every person that I looked at.
Definitely.
And I think there's a few advantages to obsession. One is that it has a narrowness and single-mindedness of focus. And so I think if I can critique other people, I would say a common thing that I witness, which I think holds people back in their learning, is they hop around too much. They don't really get into something enough before they're on to the next thing. And I mean, I could criticize myself in that regard, and that I don't go nearly as far, but I think it's at a different level that they're just they only engage in superficial activities. And so I think that's a major challenge when learning, is how do you break through that kind of difficulty barrier that's at the beginning of a lot of subjects. If you want to learn programming, there's a lot of difficulty in that first little bit of getting anything written in code. And so I think you need to have a certain kind of, this is my quest of the moment feeling to get to that point. And I think it's hard. It's hard to do that. So I think obsession is really important there. I also think that there's a certain tenacity you need, especially if you're doing self-education, because there's often these little barriers and obstacles that come up, which are surmountable, but they kind of present themselves in a way that that's too much effort. I'm going to just stop. And so people might be thinking, well, I'm not obsessed about anything. Like, how can I learn better? I think the better question is not to like, how can I make myself obsessed about this, but how can I find something that I could be obsessed about? And so I really do think that, again, sort of a bias of being in the educational system is that we've kind of inherited this idea that like, look, there's all these things that you have to learn. You have to learn them, and like, I got to go through this. Whereas I think it's a lot better to figure out like, well, what is something that I could be like really, really excited and interested about? And I think if you follow that, you end up going a lot further than just, okay, well, all right, I'm going to try to make myself obsessed about this. I don't think that works very well.
I think that's an interesting point you raised, though, because I think a lot of people want to do something. They want to improve themselves, but they don't know what. They don't know what to choose. And I think that perhaps you probably get that question quite a bit. You're like, Scott, I really want to, use these principles. I want to use these 9 principles, but I don't know what to do, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know what to implement these 9 principles towards.
Yeah, I mean, think back to stuff that you always thought was cool, but you didn't get a chance to try, Think back to like, oh yeah, I've always wanted to do this, or I've always wanted to learn this. That's to me the starting point. I think the problem is not that interest isn't there. I think the problem is that it just gets kind of smothered by everything else in our life. I think it often gets smothered by kind of failed realizations in the past too, that, I tried this, it was really hard, I wasn't very successful at it. I don't want to get burned again, right? And that's the box. I was talking about it earlier, this kind of like we live in this box of like, I'm good at this, I'm not good at this, and I live there. Like, I don't go outside of that. And so I think it can be challenging, but I think there's something kind of exciting too about, I'm going to embark on some kind of new quest that I don't quite know what the outcome is going to be, and it might change me as a person. And so I think if you can frame it in that way, there is lots of interesting things out there. And I don't know, maybe there's a whole other book about like the, psychology of obsession and motivation and this kind of stuff.
I think I'd
have to get into it, but I think that that's something that's, it's hard to force, but I think it's something you can kindle. So I don't think you can just like, okay, I have to do this. Like that doesn't work. But I think if you're just sort of like, okay, I'm kind of curious about this, you start thinking about it a little bit more, and you're like, maybe I could do this. And I mean, that's sort of how a lot of my projects came about, is that, it started with a kind of, oh, okay, like, has anyone done this before? That's kind of cool. And then you just keep thinking about it, and you sort of elaborate it in your mind and make it a bit bigger. And I think you can sort of start by dabbling with something, and then when you kind of get, maybe like you see potential in it, but you don't see the progress, that's when you switch to commitment. I know I did this with the portrait drawing challenge I did. I was doing it kind of like, I was just sort of doing it for fun. I was doing some drawing course, and I was like, oh man, my face drawings still suck at the end of this. They're not good. And I was like, I wonder if you just like did a lot of sketches and you just overlaid the original image so you could see what you're doing wrong, like if you'd quickly get really good at it. So this was sort of like the idea that I started with, which it turns out that idea gives you a little bit, but it's not like the whole way. There's other things you have to do to be able to be good at drawing faces. So sometimes your hypotheses are wrong, and so you learn from those mistakes too. But that was sort of how it started. It was like, this is interesting. I think it'd be really cool to do this. What if, right? Like, what if you could do this? And so I think that can happen sometimes too. Maybe you start watching some show and it's in French or something. And you're like, like maybe I could speak French, and I think you need to kindle those things. And I think just the way our everyday life works is to kind of smother that, with all the things that you have to do in life, and you're too busy, and it's, I can't do this, and just keeping it down. And I think so those little moments and little projects and things, to me, that's the essence of life. And so I really think you have to work to keep those sparks burning.
An interesting book that I read somewhat talks about this concept is Daily Rituals by Mason Curry.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you've read it, but basically it documents very famous artists, whether they be, painters or writers or just creative people, and it shows their daily rituals, what they used to do. And similar to your book, a thread is that they were all incredibly obsessed with whatever they were doing. They would spend hours upon hours every single day just on their craft persistently for decades. And that's pretty much, it seems like, the only way that you can get very, very good at whatever you want to do.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that like the motivation, how this works, because it's easy to look at that from the outside and be just sort of like, they're just so dedicated and they're forcing themselves. But I think what happens is you get into this kind of motivational positive feedback loop. So you get in this situation where you have some early positive experience. It could be from being successful at it, but it could also just be from, oh, that's really cool, or this kind of thing. And then you go a little bit deeper, and I think as you go deeper into something, you simultaneously get this kind of sense of accomplishment or this kind of good feeling about having gone deeper, as well as this negative absence where like what you have not yet achieved becomes more apparent and recedes into the distance. And so I think it just like pulls you forward, like it pulls you into it. And so I think that's almost a reason to get interested in the learning process itself, because the more you can get pulled into things, like I personally think it's a very positive thing. I know sometimes people, frame this in terms of like a negative feeling, because you always feel like, oh, I haven't done this at all yet. I still have to go so much further. But I think there's something really exciting about that in life, is to have these kind of new vistas open. Like to give a perfect example, like I started learning Chinese. It would probably be about 7 years ago now. And when I started, it was like, oh, this is kind of cool and it's interesting and I'm learning it. And I did this sort of intensive burst during the project, and I got like reasonably good at it. Like not at the vaulted levels of fluency, but like at a level where you could like, chit chat a little bit. And but it was just kind of like recognizing I'm here, but like, I'd really like to be here. That, then I just get sucked into it and you keep doing it. And like, as I said, with my friend giving the motivation that like, this kind of like, oh, there's still so much more that I don't know. That never goes away. It just keeps expanding, and you're like, oh man, but I don't know anything about this, or like, well, what's this then? And so I think it's like reading a murder mystery novel or something, where like once you open and you read the page, then you start pulling on it and you have to keep reading it. And so I think that's a really important part of life. And I think it's always great if the things that you get involved with in some way have some kind of inherent goodness to them, as opposed to just being some kind of trashy murder series on Netflix or something that you're like, oh yeah, I just binged like 400 hours of this or what have you. It'd be nice if the things that you get sucked into are also things that better you as a person.
Yeah, I definitely think there's some complacency that's afoot when it comes to that kind of stuff, because I think a lot of people are just like, well, I do my day job and I've got a family and that's kind of it. And I'm comfortable.
As someone
with
who
that.
does his day job and has a family, like I totally understand. I mean, I think for a lot of people, just kind of keeping their head above water can be hard. It can be hard. You're exhausted at the end of the day, and so you read like some book like, nah, I don't want to read that book. Like I want to read the book about like how to make my life easier. And I'm not here to really like push this upon anyone who doesn't feel that way. But I do feel that in that kind of wanting to, let's say, make life easier, make all the problems of life go away, I think it's often, that's a kind of negative quality, right? Like that's a kind of, I want to reduce the difficulties of my life, but it misses the positive thing. It misses the thing, like what was the thing to be really excited about, or what was the thing to drive you forward? And so I wanted to try to capture that a little bit in my book. Whether, the person who wants to hear that is going to want to hear it is a totally separate thing. But I feel for me, that's just been something that has been really central to my life. Is it like, yeah, it's great if you can be slightly more efficient and work a little bit earlier so you can, relax and have a beer on the weekend or something like this. But I think it's oh man, that would be really cool. And, this is something that's going to impact me for the rest of my life. I think, that's what motivates me.
Yeah, definitely. So for the last sort of 5 minutes, I just want to ask a couple more questions. The first one is in the book you talk about spatial repetition systems, and I correct me if I'm wrong, but you didn't mention a particular one. You mentioned Anki, but
Anki, yeah.
which one do you use daily? Do you use actual physical flashcards, or do you use like a software like Anki?
Well, okay. I should clarify. I don't use any of them daily. I used Anki. I use Anki for specific projects. So if I identify that okay, I'm going to need to memorize some things to move forward in this project, then I will use Anki for it. So, particularly for language learning, I've found it helpful. I think there can be sometimes a tendency to over rely on flashcards in a language too, but it's one of those balancing things that like there's a group of people that I think go too far, but then most people have never heard of it before. So for the most people, flashcards are pretty good. I think it's also good for things like law, or if you're learning like medicine or things like this as well. It can often be helpful just for dealing with the sheer volume of information that you have to be able to recall. You have to be able to memorize it. But at the same time, I'm not a lifelong spaced repetition system guy.
Okay.
I have some technical misgivings, which I'm sure at this late stage in the conversation, your audience really doesn't want to get into. But I feel like the theory of spaced repetition systems works really well over this kind of medium term horizon. But like I have decks right now that have just like tons of reviews that I haven't looked at, because when I'm not really, really actively in that sort of project phase, I don't just, I studied this 8 years ago, so I'm doing flashcards for it now. I don't do that.
Okay, so the purpose of flashcards is very specific for you. It's like, okay, this is the project I'm doing. These are the flashcards. You do them, but you don't really go back to them.
Well, it's not that going back to things is bad. I do think that spacing in the long term does work. I just think the algorithm for spacing doesn't work as well in the really long spate of things.
Okay.
Again, as I said, there's like technical critiques. One of them is that there's a threshold problem that like you remember it or you don't, but the memory trace is probably continuous. And so you have these situations where you have like, it's either you're going to learn it 8 years in the future, or you're going to start studying it intensively again. And that kind of difference is not such a big deal when it's a 3-month gap, but it's a really big deal when it's an 8-year gap and you have 10,000 cards. I think that the flashcards, there's an opportunity cost to doing it too. And I find that, when you're no longer actively doing using a particular skill, there's a cost to spending an hour or two a day on flashcards. And then I also think that again, the model of how it's spreading it out, this mathematical model, again, I think it probably holds at the beginning, or it's a useful approximation. But I mean, that was one of the things I found. There's evidence that this elaborative spacing schedule of where like you do this and then this and then this and then this for the spacing thing, there's actually surprisingly little evidence that that's the correct spacing schedule in terms of getting the benefits of the spacing effect. I remember talking to Jeffrey Karpicki, who's the recall research guy, and he was saying how like they did studies and they found that the even spacing worked just as well. And so I don't know, my feeling is that I like it as a tool. I think that it can be very helpful for overcoming specific challenges, but I tend to have this kind of more organic feeling of learning in the sort of broader picture, in that at the end of the day, if what you're really doing most of the time is doing flashcards as opposed to actually using the situations where you needed to recall the information, something has gone a little awry. There can be good exceptions to this, so I'm not dogmatic about it, but I do think, again, that's one of those like, if you have 40,000 flashcards for subjects that you don't actively use and you're doing it every day and it's taking you 2 hours a day, that is something I have a question mark about. But I mean, the amount of people that fit that description is pretty slim, pretty slim. Yeah. I'm like, it's only people like Very me, I think, that are even tempted to do stuff like that.
I think just so.
I do think I'm mostly on the recommending spaced repetition systems, because I think if I'm going to be on the spaced repetition system podcast, maybe I can get into a little like nitpick with people I disagree with there, but those are not for regular people.
Probably not. Lastly, I think we're a books podcast, so I know you reference a lot of books in your book and that you read and researched. So for anyone that wants they have read your book and they're listening to this and they've already read your book, or someone that is re-listening to this after having read your book because they've been so interested by what you've said, what would be some books that you've read that would be great further reading on this subject, or some that have had an impact on you in your process of becoming an ultra learner?
So a little digression here. Like I remember I had a little book club that I had on my podcast for a while. And the thing that I learned from there is that people don't want to read the books that I'm reading. And so I can give two lists here. One list is the books, if you liked my book and you want something of that genre, which is, aimed at your self-improvement, and it's going to be practical and not too dense reading. Some of my favorite books there, which I really like these books, so I'm not saying this in that I don't really like them. I really like these books. James Clear's Atomic Habits I really like. Cal Newport, well, all Cal Newport books, but Cal Newport's Deep Work is obviously up there.
Great book.
I would say that, David Allen's Getting Things Done. These are all really good books that I feel like that would be my list that I think most people would actually want to read. If you want to read more about this topic and you're as interested in as I am, and you're willing to take this at face value, some books that I really liked, I would say, I think that, also in the first column, I would put Peak. That's a kind of hybrid book. Anders Ericsson and Robert Poole did Peak. It's a kind of, if you want, you can read Anders Ericsson's technical monographs if you want to read the super academic ones. But some books that I've read recently that I really liked. I really like John Dewey's Democracy in Education. It's an oldie but a goodie. I think for a sort of counterintuitive viewpoint, I think all of the I think Jean Lave, I think is how you say her name, JeanLave. She's a sort of anthropologist, and she has some really interesting books. So I think Situated Learning, I think, is her most popular one, and it's a pretty big, pretty slim one. I think other books that I've enjoyed recently, I think. I've read a lot of books on transfer recently, so I think, but I'm not sure how many of those are easily available. But I think, A Human Memory by Alan Badley is a really good one if you want to learn more about memory. That's a textbook I found valuable. I think, anything you could get on cognitive science is good too. There's a lot of different books on cognitive science. I have one on my shelf here, this massive one. It's called Foundations of Cognitive Science.
Anything that has foundations in it, it's going to be
technical. And I was looking, I have not read that one, but I've read a lot of the things by the authors. It's like a multi-author book, and I was like, okay, I know what is going to be in this book. But so I think those are all really good subjects. If you want to go the courses route, for a popular course that I think is really, really good, I would just the Learning How to Learn course by Terry Sinowski and Barbara Oakley, I think is really good. Lots of people have found me through that course, so I think it's a good course just because it overviews a lot of the theory and research.
Which institution was that with?
That's Coursera. I don't know which university it's affiliated with. I think maybe UC San Diego, but it's on Coursera.
Perfect. Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us and discuss your book, Ultralearning, Accelerate Your Career, Master Hard Skills, and Outsmart the Competition. So much to learn within the book and obviously during this conversation. Lastly, where's the best place for people to find you if they want to contact you?
Right. So best place is to go to my website. That's scotthyoung.com, SCOTTHYLUNG.com. And you can also get my book, Ultralearning. It's, again, Amazon, Barnes & Nobles. You can also get it at Audible. And so if you're willing to listen to me a bit further, you can get the audio version of it too.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Also, visit our website, www.booktalktoday.com, to subscribe and download the latest edition of our magazine. Join our mailing list to receive the first issue for free to get a taste for the value-packed content that we are offering. Book Talk Today, for readers, by readers.